So, if I can, I'd like to touch as briefly as I can on 4 issues that were raised by the other presentations. One, how the price is set, whether it's set in the market or by a range tax schedule, how you return the money, offsets, and simplicity. So how is the price set? So Charlie just made the case that letting the market set the price for carbon under a cap is a bad idea for lots of reasons. You know, and I actually, politics aside, disagree with that. I think that, you know, look, first of all, look at our economy. All the commodities in our economy, the price of them is set in the market. Sometimes there are problems, but most of the time, actually, it kind of works. It works for wheat, works for corn, and we're not going to get rid of that system. Whether you like the system or not, we live in a market economy. So the answer to abuses of commodity markets is to regulate the markets more effectively, and we at least took some steps to try to do that. Probably not good enough, but I think that's the way to address the issue on that. The other argument has been made is, well, you know, when the economy is down, the price of carbon collapses. And we look at the European Union, and readily the price of carbon is down, and that shows that the system fails. I think that's actually backwards. If the price is low in any particular period, either the cap was set too loosely, which is you know, a political problem about whether you have the power to set it stringently or not, or you know, you actually want the price to go down during a recession. It provides a countercyclical boost to the economy. So that's actually a good feature of cap and trade, not a detriment. And the third issue that Charlie talked about is that, you know, having the price of carbon will improve your focus on your return for energy efficiency and other types of technology, which I agree with. It's actually even more true with a cap, because not only do you, if you become more efficient in, say, insulating your house, you know, that the direct effect you get is you lower your costs. Your costs are lower by even more because there's that carbon is priced into the cost. But at a macro level, you also lower the carbon price. Charlie again said that was a bad thing. But if in fact we have an appropriate budget for carbon, having a higher carbon price is not inherently what we're after. If we have in fact limited the pollution to the levels we need to, then if we're able to achieve energy efficiency measures that make that cheaper than we thought, great. And in fact, as a motivator for policymakers who are setting CAFE standards, for example, or building codes, the idea that if they do a good job, that the price of carbon won't rise as much as it would otherwise could be a very effective motivator. So I think that's a good thing too. Okay, how do you return the money? So I think the important thing to note about this is that is not an inherent feature of any of these systems, whether it's a cap and tax, cap and dividend, cap and trade, whatever you call it. You have a range of choices about how you return the money. This is fundamentally a political issue. It's sort of what Congress was established by the Constitution to do. It's a distributional issue. If I was writing a bill, politics aside, I would do something very similar to what Peter said. Auction all the permits, return 75% on with payroll tax reduction, slight difference, but let's not make that a matter of principle. It's a nuance. And then spend the other 25% investing in innovation for high-cost technologies to bring those costs down and to overcome barriers for energy efficiency. That's what I would do. But as Peter acknowledged, the biggest problem with that is it doesn't address the regional disparities. I don't believe you can get a bill passed unless you try to address the regional disparities in some ways. There's better ways to do that and worse ways to do that. The cap and trade bill that passed the House did that by, and here I have to say I'm very disappointed with my friends who are advocates of climate protection for demagoguing the House bill by calling it a giveaway to polluters or to utilities. A substantial amount of the revenues of the value of allowances were returned to consumers through regulated local distribution companies. So through regulated utilities, so it would be returned to you with lower electricity rates than they would otherwise be. Is that the most efficient way to do it or most elegant? No, I don't think so. It was a politically expedient approach that did not affect the environmental integrity of the bill at all, and maybe made it a little bit less efficient, but it was a way to address those disparities. As Peter said, said, you got to address them one way or the other. I agree there are better ways to do it, but that's what it was there for. Try not to monopolize the time. Very quickly on offsets, I'll just say offsets are not an inherent feature of having a cap. We had the Clear Act, which didn't have offsets, the Waxman Markey bill that did. That represented a sort of clear choice between Waxman Markey, which had stronger emission reduction targets, particularly in the near to medium term, and offsets to make those more affordable, and the Clear Act, which had weaker targets in the safety valve and not offsets. So I can respect the people who made the other choice. My view was that I'd rather have the stronger targets, recognizing that offsets can be problematic, but that if you establish the right targets, you have an opportunity through advocacy of improving the regulatory system to try and tighten up offsets over time. Not that they'll ever be perfect. Again, politics aside, I would rather go with no offsets, no problem. Finally, I just end on simplicity. Again, I expected the right to attack the climate bill and the opponents of climate protection to attack it for being too complicated. You know what? I'm disappointed in my friends for demagoguing on being long. You know, climate change is a pretty complicated problem. And if it takes 1,400 pages, by the way, those are triple-spaced 14-point font, to get a bill that does the job, so be it. You know, War and Peace was a long book. That didn't mean it was a bad book. So I'd rather debate on the merits, and there's plenty of those to debate. Thanks.
Well, I agree with most of what Dan just said, particularly at the beginning when he was talking about a cap. That the variation in price that would accompany a cap is okay. I agree, so I won't say much about that, except when we think about it, you know, having been a businessman, it doesn't bother me that I can't exactly predict, you know, everything is going to cost for the next 20 years. I'm accustomed to dealing with a certain amount of uncertainty in prices, but the cap, especially a cap with a price collar, tells you enough that these prices are going to go up for the next 20 or 30 years, and that's all I need to know to make the right sorts of decisions. What else? The one thing I wanted to say to Charlie, though, was, you know, you guys, you carbon tax guys, you've got this Larson bill in the House, but as I said at the beginning, the action is going to start in the Senate. We've got a Cantwell-Collins bipartisan cap and dividend bill in there. As I said, we'll probably have a few more co-sponsors this year. You guys, it's hard to compare, you know, a real bill against a concept that doesn't have actual numbers attached to it. It'll be really interesting to see if you can get a bill introduced in the Senate and see what numbers you've got, what prices you've got, and what all the loopholes are. And I noticed just today, because Larson was here the other day, somebody came up to me and said, look, there's offsets in the Larson bill. Well, you know, the devil is always in the details. We've got our bill laid out there. There are some details that could be tweaked, but we really need to see yours. And if you can't come up with one in a relatively short period of time, then I think you ought to get behind the Cantwell-Collins bill.
Well, I was hoping to get the two of you over to my side. You know, since I had a chance to come back to both of you, maybe I should waive my response at this time, and we can have Mark throw it open to questions from the floor.
Just take 5 minutes and answer. I mean, the audience deserves to hear your response to those charges.
I should have been scribbling more furiously than I was. Peter, I know that you are a retired successful businessman, and I admire what you created as a businessman. correct me if I'm wrong, your business was not particularly energy intensive. And you were not charged in one way or another with making decisions that were particularly sort of fuel critical or carbon critical. And I would argue that for the industrialists and other decision makers who are creating products, designing new technologies, envisioning power plants, and making locational decisions, all of which will have implications lasting for decades and will lock us in for better or worse into certain levels of carbon consumption and emission. They may not need to know the last decimal point on the carbon price, and of course they won't know it anyway because the political system can modify previous edicts. But they need and deserve to have some reasonable sense of the trajectory, and I think it's got to be both a thinner band of uncertainty and, frankly, a more steeply rising price than either of you have been willing to subscribe to. And I base that latter point on, I guess, 40 years of experience in trying to promote as well as analyze energy efficiency and renewable energy. It seems that each price point that we think is going to bring about the reduction in driving, the conversion, large-scale conversion to more fuel-efficient cars, the emergence of regional rail over air travel for trips of less than, say, 600 or 800 miles. These things don't sort of really happen because the expense of doing them turns out to be greater than had been anticipated. And a price, in the Cantwell-Collins price collar, I could have thrown that up on the chart instead of Waxman-Markey, and it would have had pretty much the same modest results. I mean, good if we had a century to deal with this problem, but inadequate if we have only a few years to make a genuine start on it, and maybe a decade to begin making a serious dent in it. As for introducing a bill in the Senate, we're just going to have to find among those 100 members, of whom, 53 are still Democrats, and maybe there are a few on the other side who are prepared to be the Bob Inglis's of the Senate. It is easier in some way psychologically, and I think it was Bob Filner who referred to this, to be outside the corridors of power. You can be more risk-taking and less risk-averse. And while it's true that we weren't able to find a Senate champion in the last couple of years, I don't think the game is settled as to our ability to find one going forward.
Thank you so much for speaking. It seems clear to me that although there are differences between these two options, the goal is the same. It's to reduce our carbon emissions. Do you feel as though our attention and the energy we're spending debating cap and trade versus tax fractures the potential unity of a movement to just get one of these through?
Thanks for that question. That does concern me quite a bit, actually. One could argue that the lack of unity what Chris called climate hawks, or climate activists, made it much more difficult to pass legislation this year. I would say, if you really analyze it objectively, the fundamental reason we were not able to pass legislation was that the Republican strategy in this Congress was to stop everything, and that the details ultimately didn't matter. So probably, no matter what we did on that front, it wouldn't matter, but we don't know, and it certainly didn't help. Going forward, I think we all agree it's very easy to say, well, I have a bill that was introduced that sets a higher carbon price than your policy would do. You know what? Thousands of bills are introduced every year. Until we actually get one passed, the carbon price is zero. And we all agree that that's a really bad outcome. So for the next 2 years, we're not going to be able to change that in terms of any of these schemes. But the one thing that we can do that will start to internalize the cost of burning fossil fuels will be EPA regulations. So I fervently hope that coming out of this room, we have whatever debates we want here, but that the primary energy going forward is to build a movement that can win comprehensive, effective legislation in 2013, and that in the meantime, we are totally united in protecting the authority that EPA currently does have.
Hi. My question is about addressing the price of carbon emissions from things that we import. To me, it doesn't seem okay. We're not going to solve the climate problem if we don't account for the emissions that are coming through. Okay, from the things we import from China that has more emissions than we do. And on top of that, I see one of the first issues raised about any tax that we have in the country being that, well, we'll just send our jobs overseas because they can do it cheaper and they don't have a tax over there. So, address that.
Good question. It has been addressed in the Campbell-Collins bill, and I think probably every other climate bill that's been introduced, with this mechanism called a border adjustment fee. So if China, which let's say doesn't have a carbon price equivalent to ours, is exporting some product that embodies carbon, there would be a border adjustment fee. And what's nice about that system is that not only does it protect American manufacturers, but as the carbon price rises and the border adjustment fee rises and China is exporting less and less, unless it raises its own carbon price. It's kind of a dynamic system that will actually, over time, kind of harmonize higher carbon prices internationally. In the absence of an international treaty, this may in fact be the mechanism that drives carbon prices up all over the world.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Turn it on.
Thank you very much for your presentation. There seems to be a contract between saying I'm after a limit or a price, a cap or a price. But it seems to me a cap implies a price, and a price implies a quantity.
Correct.
That will be used. And it would be very much more useful if you, whichever you're after, you would say, I want a 10%, I think we should have a 10% reduction via a cap. The implicit price will go up 20%. Or to say we should have 20 ton tax, and that will probably reduce consumption 15%.
I think we kind of all agree with that, and that was my point up front, which is what we really want is a climate that is not dangerously disrupted. And that means dramatically reducing emissions, and we really need to keep our eye on that goal and try to build a movement around it.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. For a bunch of us policy nerds under the age of 25, this is what we'd like to do on a Saturday evening, so thanks. And for everyone. So my question is something that, so the three of you have talked about some ways to price carbon. One thing that hasn't been talked about is repealing fossil fuel subsidies as a way to raise prices. Is that just a political non-starter? Is that totally DOA, or is that something that we should be talking about as well? Thanks.
Whether or not it's politically DOA, we should all be talking about it all the time and be pressing for it because it's the right policy and it's also good politics to constantly emphasize the ways in which the fossil fuel industry is benefiting from largesse coming from the vast array of American taxpayers. Unfortunately, the numbers are such that even if we could overnight repeal all fossil fuel subsidies, that would amount to maybe about, I don't know, that would equate to adding maybe $10 or at most $15 per ton of CO2 to the average implied price of carbon pollution. It's very helpful. But when you consider that the Larson bill would begin at $15 per ton of CO2 and then go up every year by $10 per ton of CO2, which we at the Carbon Tax Center think is the appropriate trajectory. And you saw on that graphic how much of a reduction that would achieve in just 10 years. This subsidy elimination is helpful, but it's a modest step at best on getting us off carbon.
Sir?
I'd like to ask if the panelists think that a cap and trade approach is really dead for this foreseeable future.
Well, I think it's certainly dead for the next 2 years. And I think a comprehensive bill as with the scope of the bill that the House passed in 2009 is probably not on the table for a long time. I could imagine a more targeted sectoral cap bill in 2013, perhaps focused on stationary sources, electric power plants, large industrial sources.
I would just like to take this opportunity to say that I think it is dead forever. I hope it is dead forever. And I hope that NRDC and maybe even EDF will accept that it's dead forever and not immediately, but over time, start looking at some alternatives.
Hi there. Here? Yeah? It strikes me that as we're sitting here discussing what are, to me, important nuances of different approaches to pricing carbon, the American populace has just elected into office a whole slew of people that don't even acknowledge that this is actually a problem, or work to the opposite end. And that, you know, we say, we like cap and dividend with this and that and some offsets and not this, and they say, you're elitist. And we say, no, we'd like to think about a carbon tax to do this and this and this, and they say, you know, climate change is false and you're trying to, like, you know, kill the American public. I mean, so to me, I think what's the much more important matter is the political and kind of popular viability of any of these plans. And I think, Charles, I appreciate that you spoke to that with the tax, that it's actually something that can, you know, people can kind of internalize. What would you say about the actual kind of popular viability of any of these plans?
That's another great question. I know it can seem, you know, quixotic, hopefully not self-indulgent for, you know, for us to be here debating these nuances. What I would like to see going forward politically with respect to climate, I mean, there are many things, but the one thing I would say most is to fight back, to hit hard, to pull no punches, to get off the defensive. And I'm hoping, and maybe it's just a scenario that I'm, you know, spinning, when I heard Bill McKibben last night raise the specter of Scopes monkey trials, if you know that reference, coming up in congressional investigations, you know, going forward. I would like our climate scientists, and not them alone, because they, you know, they've already suffered enough, but they've got to be backed by us as they tell these inquisitors in Congress, you are the ones who should be on trial, not us. You are the ones.
Let me just add a couple of data points about the election. Climate change was only on the ballot in one place, which was California, and we won by 21 points, so that's good news. NRDC Action Fund, LCB, did an election night survey of voters in 22 battleground congressional districts and asked them about what they thought about a comprehensive clean energy and climate bill, and it said, described the goals, and then it said, you know, the opponents call this a cap and tax that would just kill jobs. Or something to that effect, and you can find the details on the Action Fund website. And by about 20 points, the people who actually voted said that they would, they supported that idea, and by something close to 20 points, that they were more favorably inclined towards candidates who supported that bill than ones who didn't. So, with a couple of clear exceptions, Bob Inglis being one of them, people who voted the right way on climate change, who lost, didn't lose because of this issue. So let's not let's not get totally demoralized by the election results. But they certainly create a challenge for us.
Hi, I just have a question, and specifically. I know this was probably talked a lot more in detail at one of the 3 o'clock workshops, but about tax shifting or green checks. And I just have a concern that with, which I think is more of a actual practical solution with actual carbon taxing, because it's more of a personable sort of policy, and I think we're going to see more grassroots sort of reaction to it. I'm just worried about with the wealthier people that are already able to drive, you know, huge SUVs around and just guzzle through gas and not care whatsoever. How would we distribute these green checks, or directly, you know, give them the money back? In such a way that would that would prevent them from abusing their wealthiness in a way that's, you know, going to make up for the carbon that they're putting into the atmosphere. So.
Peter could probably answer this better than I, but he's declined. The beauty of the green check idea, which is common between the two of us, is that every person living in America gets the same monthly check, regardless of whether they're at the top or the bottom of the income and wealth spectrum. But the amount that people will have paid in the carbon permits or the carbon fee or tax will be a direct function of how wealthy they are, and therefore how much they're spending on carbon and energy with their second and third homes and their SUVs, as you said, and all the other ways in which people consume energy. So if the green check, and I'm just making up a number, this is not a real number, if it's $100 a month per person, you know, looking at you, I kind of have a sense that you're a pretty low carbon kind of guy. You know, your expenditures on electricity and fuel, and that includes, you know, the stuff that you buy and the fuel that went in to make those things, because that's the carbon fee or is going to raise the price of those things. You know, you might be a $15 or $20 a month expenditure into the carbon revenue pie kind of guy, whereas Mr. SUV might be, you know, $300. So you and he get the same $100. You're $85 ahead. He's $200 behind. I really like that, and I like it not just because it distributes income and wealth from the top down to the bottom, which this country sorely needs for reasons that have to do with everything and, you know, aside from climate, but because it does embody the polluter pay principle. It's real justice in any adjective you want to put in front of the noun justice. It's there.
I just want to quickly add to what Charlie said, that a green check would not be a check. It would be an electronic funds transfer straight into your bank account or debit card. So just don't think about paper checks anymore.
Well, let's thank our panelists again for sitting up here.